The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It sounds like a line from a bad sitcom, I know, but trust me, what unfolded was far from humorous. It started, as these things often do, with something utterly ridiculous. A $500 fine for what the Homeowners Association, or HOA, deemed unauthorized recreational activity on what they insisted was community property. What they didn't know, what she, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, Brenda Blackwood, absolutely did not know, was that I had inherited something far more valuable than a house with a view. I promise you, you won't see this ending coming. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place, because my solution, I assure you, was comprehensive. I had moved into the house a year earlier, a quiet retreat after the loudest, most devastating silence of my life. My wife, Sarah, had passed away suddenly, and the sprawling suburban home we'd built together felt like a mausoleum. I needed a different kind of quiet, a place where the air itself felt like a balm. That's what brought me to grandfather's old lake house, a modest but beautiful property nestled on the edge of Lake Willow Creek, a small, pristine body of water that had been a part of my family for generations. My grandfather, a man of quiet strength and surprising foresight, had left it to me. He had always called it the sanctuary. I was an engineer, or had been, a software architect, to be precise. My professional life had been a constant dance with logic, systems, and anticipating failure points. I built complex solutions, understood intricate networks, and, perhaps most relevantly, knew how to reverse engineer problems. But all of that felt distant now. My days revolved around walks with my old Labrador, Baxter, meticulously tending the small vegetable garden Sarah had always wanted, and, most of all, fishing. The lake was my solace. Its surface, sometimes glassy and still, sometimes rippling with a gentle breeze, mirrored the shifting landscape of my own grief. I'd spend hours there, casting my line, watching the sunlight dance on the water, feeling a faint echo of Sarah's presence in the quiet beauty. It was my sacred space, the only place where the sharp edges of loss seemed to soften, where I could breathe without the weight of expectation. It connected me to my grandfather, too, who had taught me to fish on these very shores when I was a boy, and to Sarah, who had always loved watching me out on the water. Then came Brenda. Brenda Blackwood, the self-crowned HOA president, was a woman who seemed to have weaponized the concept of community standards. She wore her authority like a cheaply acquired crown, heavy with self-importance, perched precariously on a coif head of stiff, blonde hair that perpetually looked like it had been styled specifically for Universal Studios theme park character who demanded to speak to the manager. Her usual uniform was a crisp, too-tight pants suit, regardless of the weather, and a perpetually pursed mouth that hinted at a constant state of disapproval. Her car, a gleaming white Mercedes SUV that always seemed to take up 2 parking spots, was less a mode of transport and more a mobile monument to her perceived superiority. She had moved into the largest house on the development, one of those McMansions built on a plot carved out of what had once been part of the vast tract of land my grandfather had owned, only 5 years prior. In that time, she had, by sheer force of will and an uncanny ability to manipulate bylaws, seized control of the HOA, transforming it from a benign neighborhood collective into her personal fiefdom. Our first proper interaction, the spark that ignited the bonfire, occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. The air was warm, a gentle breeze rustling the willow trees that dipped their branches into the lake. I was on my small aluminum fishing boat, an old relic my grandfather had lovingly maintained, maybe 50 feet from my private dock, enjoying the quiet. I had just landed a decent-sized base when I heard a shrill voice cut through the afternoon serenity. "You, Mr. Henderson, what do you think you're doing out there?" I looked up. Brenda stood on the newly installed, highly polished communal dock, an improvement she had spearheaded, and I later learned, grossly overcharged the community for. Hands on her hips, her face contorted into a mask of righteous indignation. Behind her, like a pair of anxious acolytes, stood 2 other HOA board members, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm fishing, Brenda," I replied, my voice calm, the easy peace of the afternoon still clinging to me. I held up the base. Having some luck, actually. Her mouth tightened, her eyes narrowing to slits. Luck or not, you're in violation of community guidelines. Section 4, subsection beta, paragraph 3 clearly states that all recreational watercraft must be registered with the HOA, and furthermore, no personal motorized craft are permitted on Lake Willow Creek. The fines for such infractions begin at $250 per occurrence. I frowned. It's not motorized, Brenda. It's a rowboat, and I've been fishing here for weeks without issue. My grandfather used this boat for decades. Your grandfather, she sniffed, as if the very mention of him left a bad taste in her mouth, is no longer with us, and frankly, his activities are irrelevant to current HOA regulations. As for your boat, it has a trolling motor, which constitutes a motorized craft, and weeks without issue does not grant you immunity from the rules. This is community property, Mr. Henderson, and we have rules for a reason. Rules designed to maintain the aesthetic integrity and environmental balance of our shared resources. She paused, puffing out her chest slightly, as if she had just delivered a profound philosophical truth. You'll be receiving a notice shortly. That's $500, Mr. Henderson. $250 for the unregistered craft, and another $250 for the unauthorized motor. I stared at her, then down at my simple boat, then at the lake, which had always felt like an extension of my own property. $500 for fishing in a rowboat? The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a moment. $500? I finally managed, my voice sharper than I intended. That's preposterous. Preposterous, Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, is your flagrant disregard for the bylaws we all agreed to when we purchased our homes in this esteemed community. Consider this your first and final warning before further action is taken. She then turned on her heel, her two nervous followers scrambling to keep pace, and marched back toward the manicured lawns of the development. I sat in my boat, the fishing rod still in my hand, the bass flopping gently in the cooler. My initial reaction was a surge of pure, hot anger. It wasn't just the $500, though that was a ridiculous sum for a non-issue. It was the condescension, the thinly veiled contempt, the immediate, arrogant assertion of authority where in my gut I felt she had none. My home, my sanctuary, was being invaded, policed by a woman who saw rules as weapons and community as her personal kingdom. A part of me, the part that craved peace, that was still nursing the raw wounds of grief, wanted to just pay the fine, swallow the bitter pill, register the damn boat, and just keep my head down. It was a small lake, and she clearly held the reins of the HOA. Was a fishing spot worth the escalating conflict? My life had been too full of conflict lately, too many battles I couldn't win. I had simply wanted to fade into the background, to mend in quiet solitude. But then I thought of grandfather. Grandfather, a man who never raised his voice but whose quiet resolve could move mountains. He had built this house, nurtured this land, fished this lake his entire life. He believed in fairness, in standing your ground when you were right, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. He once told me, son, peace isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes, earning it means pushing back against what's wrong. I thought of Sarah, too. Her pragmatism, her fierce sense of justice. She would have laughed at the absurdity of a $500 fine for a rowboat, but she would have been equally furious at the bullying. She would have told me to fight, to not let anyone walk all over me or the memory of my family. The anger solidified into something colder, something more dangerous. This wasn't just about a fine or a fishing boat. This was about principle. This was about my sanctuary, my legacy, being trampled by an arrogant, self-serving tyrant. This was about standing up for what was mine, for what was right. I was tired of feeling helpless, tired of letting others dictate the terms of my life. The sleeping giant, as some of my former colleagues used to call me when I got particularly engrossed in a complex problem, had been awakened. The next morning, the notice arrived, a formal-looking document with the HOA's logo prominently displayed, detailing the two separate $500 fines, now totaling $1,000, citing bylaws I knew didn't fully apply to my rowboat and its tiny auxiliary trolling motor. It also stated that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien on my property. That was it. That was the line. They wanted to put a lien on grandfather's house. On my house. The gloves were off. My engineering mind, dormant for too long, were to life. I knew systems. I knew how to dissect them, find their weaknesses, and exploit them. The HOA was just a system, a set of rules and agreements. And every system had a foundation. I decided to start at the very beginning. I began with the property deeds. My grandfather had been meticulous, a man who believed in keeping every document, every scrap of paper. His old roll-top desk in the study was a treasure trove of historical documents. I found the original deed for the property, dating back to the 1950s. It wasn't just for the house and the few acres surrounding it. It was for a much larger tract of land, encompassing not just my current plot, but also a significant portion of what was now the entire subdivision, including, crucially, Lake Willow Creek itself. The original deed detailed the sale of over 300 acres from a large farming estate to my grandfather. It meticulously described the boundaries, using old-fashioned metes and bounds, referencing ancient oak trees and stone walls that were no longer there, but also, critically, referencing the entire lake as being within the purchased boundary. It was all there in black and white. Grandfather had owned the lake. All of it. But how had the HOA claimed it? As community property? I dug deeper. I spent days at the county recorder's office, poring over microfiches and dusty ledgers. I researched the subdivision's development, tracing the successive sales of parcels from my grandfather's original tract. The developers, it turned out, had bought large sections of his land in the 1990s to build the Willow Creek estates. They had carved out lots, built houses, and established the HOA to manage the shared amenities. But something was missing. Or rather, something was not missing. Nowhere in any of the subsequent deeds, in any of the HOA's founding documents, in any of the property transfers, was there a record of my grandfather ever having sold, relinquished, or transferred ownership of Lake Willow Creek. The lake was simply never mentioned in the subdivision deeds. It was as if the developers had built around it, assuming it was public land, or perhaps simply ignoring it, focused only on the buildable plots. But my grandfather's original deed was unambiguous. He owned the lake, and he had passed that ownership directly to me, explicitly stated in his will alongside the house. The lake was mine, all of it. It was a revelation, a light suddenly piercing through the fog of my grief and frustration. It was the ultimate leverage, a loaded weapon I hadn't even known I possessed. Brenda Blackwood, in her arrogant dismissal of my grandfather's legacy, had stumbled into a hornet's nest she could never have foreseen. She had declared war on the wrong person, on the wrong property. The first person I called was Mr. Harrison, an old family friend and a retired real estate lawyer who had handled many of my grandfather's affairs. He was in his late 70s, sharp as a tack, with a dry wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of property law. "Henderson, my boy," he boomed over the phone, his voice gravelly but warm. "Long time no hear. How's the fishing?" "Mr. Harrison," I said, a rare smile touching my lips. "The fishing is about to get very interesting. I think I found something remarkable in grandfather's papers. Can I bring them over?" He spent 2 hours poring over the documents I'd painstakingly gathered, the original deed, the various subdivision plats, the HOA's articles of incorporation, even aerial photos from different decades. He nodded, hummed, occasionally chuckled, and finally leaned back in his leather chair, a satisfied glint in his eye. "Well, I'll be," he said, tapping a finger on the original deed. "Your grandfather, bless his soul, was always a step ahead. He never sold the lake." The developers, in their haste and perhaps their arrogance, simply assumed it was unowned land or public water or part of some communal parcel. They built around it, relying on what they thought they knew, not what was legally documented. Every single deed for every single home in that development, Mr. Henderson, ends at the shoreline. They own up to the water's edge, but not a single one owns a square inch of the water itself. And the HOA, by extension, has no claim either because it was never conveyed to them. So it's mine? I asked, the words feeling weighty, almost surreal. Legally speaking, Mr. Harrison affirmed, a wide grin spreading across his face, Lake Willow Creek is your private property. All of it. The water, the lake bed, the fishing rights, the surface rights, the subsurface rights, everything. You, my dear boy, own the entire lake. A strange mix of vindication and exhilarating power surged through me. It was like suddenly discovering I was a king, not just a resident in my own quiet kingdom. What do I do now? I asked, leaning forward. Mr. Harrison steepled his fingers. Well, that depends. What do you want to do? I want to make Brenda Blackwood understand the true meaning of unauthorized recreational activity, I said, my voice low and steady. And I want to ensure no one else in this community ever has to deal with her petty tyranny again. I want justice, Mr. Harrison, for my grandfather, for Sarah, and for everyone else she's bullied. He nodded slowly. A worthy goal. You have the ultimate leverage. The key now is strategy. You want to play this like a chess game, not a brawl. Let her make the mistakes, then deliver the checkmate. We'll draft a very polite, very legal letter stating your ownership. You won't demand anything yet, just inform. That's your first move. Over the next few weeks, I became a silent, meticulous observer. I installed high-definition security cameras facing the lake and the communal dock, recording everything. I started a detailed log of every perceived infraction by Brenda and the HOA. Inflated fines issued to other residents, arbitrary rule changes, public shaming during HOA meetings, misuse of community funds for lavish parties at our own home, even the questionable contract for the communal docks construction. I talked to other residents, quietly, casually, listening to their complaints, gathering their stories of frustration and fear. There was the single mother who was fined for having a vegetable patch deemed unmanicured. The elderly couple threatened with legal action over a slightly overgrown rose bush. The family whose children's bicycles were confiscated for being improperly stored in their own driveway. The community was simmering with resentment, but too afraid to act. My goal was not just to defeat Brenda, but to empower them. Mr. Harrison sent the letter. It was a masterpiece of understated legal power. It formally asserted my complete and sole ownership of Lake Willow Creek, citing the original deed, the grandfather's will, and the lack of any subsequent conveyance. It didn't demand anything, didn't threaten, just stated the fact politely. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor before the earthquake. Brenda's response was precisely what Mr. Harrison and I had predicted: dismissive contempt. Her return letter, sent by her HOA-retained lawyer, a smarmy individual named Mr. Sterling, was a bland, boilerplate rejection, calling my claim frivolous and without merit, suggesting I was attempting to extort the community, and reiterating the $1,000 fine, now with added daily late fees. She didn't even bother to research. She simply dismissed it out of hand, assuming I was another easily intimidated resident. Her hubris was a thing of terrifying beauty. She also escalated her personal vendetta against me. She dispatched Mr. and Mrs. Peterson to photograph my property daily, ostensibly to document violations. She sent me a formal notice that my grandfather's cherished fishing dock, which had stood for 70 years, was dilapidated and a hazard to public safety, and would be torn down unless I undertook immediate and costly repairs, to be approved by the HOA, of course. She began parking her Mercedes directly in front of my driveway, blocking access for hours at a time, claiming she was supervising community maintenance. It was petty, infuriating, and utterly predictable. My cameras captured every single incident. My log grew thicker. Then she crossed the ultimate line. One afternoon, I returned from an errand to find a crew of landscapers, clearly hired by the HOA, digging up the small memorial garden Sarah and I had planted by the lake in her memory. They were pulling out the hydrangeas and irises she had loved, replacing them with sterile, uniform shrubs Brenda had decreed. My heart hammered with a cold fury. This wasn't just about property or power anymore. This was a direct assault on my grief, on Sarah's memory. I confronted the landscapers, who, to their credit, looked uncomfortable. They had simply been following orders. I immediately called Brenda. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" I roared into the phone, my voice shaking with uncharacteristic rage. Her voice was saccharine sweet, dripping with false concern. "Oh, Mr. Henderson, I'm so sorry if there was a misunderstanding. We're just implementing the new landscaping plan for the communal lakefront area. It's for the good of the community, you see. Your little patch, while quaint, simply didn't fit the new aesthetic." That little patch was a memorial garden for my late wife. I shouted, my control slipping. "Well, I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Henderson," she said, her tone devoid of any genuine empathy, "but personal memorials are simply not permitted on community property. It creates an unsightly precedent. I'm sure you understand. If you'd like, you can collect the salvage plants from the compost heap by the maintenance shed." She then hung up before I could respond. That was it. The last flicker of hesitation vanished. My grief, once a paralyzing weight, now fueled a cold, precise resolve. She wanted to hurt me? She wanted to erase my past, my legacy? She wanted war? She had it. And she had absolutely no idea who she was fighting. The master plan unfolded in 2 phases. Phase 1, a legal declaration that would hit her like a lightning bolt. Phase 2, a public unmasking that would strip her of every shred of dignity and authority. Mr. Harrison and I filed a lawsuit, not against the HOA, but against Brenda Blackwood personally and against the developers who had created the subdivision. The suit sought an injunction to prevent any further use of Lake Willow Creek by anyone other than myself, and damages for trespass, nuisance, and emotional distress, specifically citing the desecration of the memorial garden and the continuous harassment. The core of the suit, of course, was my undisputed ownership of the lake. We also sent a certified letter to every resident of Willow Creek Estates, a simple, factual document, not from the HOA, but from me. It stated clearly and unequivocally that I was the sole legal owner of Lake Willow Creek and that, effective immediately, all access to the lake by non-residents of my property, including HOA members, was revoked. No more swimming, no more fishing, no more communal dock. The lake was closed. Forever. At least for them. The uproar was immediate and seismic. The phone lines at the HOA office, Brenda's personal number, and even my own, lit up like Christmas trees. People were furious, confused, disbelieving. How could one person own the entire lake? It had always been community property. Brenda, cornered, reacted exactly as I knew she would. She called an emergency HOA meeting, a town hall gathering in the community center designed, no doubt, to rally the troops against me, to cast me as the villain, the greedy neighbor holding the entire community hostage. "This is outrageous," she shrieked to a packed room, her face flushed, veins throbbing in her neck. Her hair, usually so rigid, seemed to have taken on a life of its own, strands escaping its perfect shellac. "Mr. Henderson is attempting to defraud this community. He's trying to steal what is rightfully ours. Our beautiful lake, the jewel of Willow Creek. This so-called lawsuit is nothing more than a desperate, pathetic attempt to line his pockets and disrupt our harmonious way of life." The room buzzed with angry murmurs. People were scared. They had bought homes here because of the lake, because of the lifestyle it promised. Now, one man, the quiet engineer from the old lake house, was threatening to take it all away. "He claims some ancient deed," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "He claims his grandfather never sold it. It's preposterous, utterly baseless. Our lawyers are already moving to have this ridiculous claim dismissed. We will fight this. We will fight him. And we will win." She pounded the podium for emphasis. "This is an attack on every single one of you, on our property values, on our very way of life." She had framed it as an us versus him scenario, casting herself as the valiant protector of the community. She was good at that, at manipulating emotions. But I had prepared for this. When the floor was open for questions, I raised my hand. Brenda, after a moment of hesitation, her eyes narrowing as if considering refusing me, finally pointed. Yes, Mr. Henderson. I suppose you'd like to speak. Though I warn you, we have no tolerance for your fabrications. I walked calmly to the microphone, Mr. Harrison beside me, a stack of documents in his hands. The room quieted, a collective tension filling the air. I looked directly at Brenda, who stood rigid behind the podium, her eyes daring me to utter a single word out of line. Thank you, Brenda, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify a few things. I turned to the assembled residents. Brenda is right about one thing. This is about ownership. It's about truth. And it's about a pattern of abuse that has gone on for too long in this community. A few gasps, a few nervous coughs. Brenda bristled, her jaw tight. I have filed a lawsuit, I continued, to formally assert my ownership of Lake Willow Creek. My grandfather purchased the land, including the entire lake, in 1957. Every subsequent sale of lots in this subdivision, including Brenda's own property, explicitly details that the property lines end at the lake's shoreline. The lake itself was never sold. It was never conveyed to the developers, and it was never conveyed to the HOA. It was passed down through my grandfather's will directly to me. I have the original deeds, the surveys, and the legal documentation right here. I gestured to Mr. Harrison, who held up a thick binder. This is nonsense, Brenda shrieked. A disparate fabrication. Is it, Brenda? I asked, turning my full attention to her. My voice dropped slightly, taking on a dangerous edge. Because for the past several weeks, I have meticulously documented your fabrications, your abuses, your lies. I nodded to a projection screen at the side of the room. One of the community members I had quietly reached out to, a brilliant young IT professional who had also suffered under Brenda's rule, had set up the projector. The first image flashed on the screen, a grainy, time-stamped photo of Brenda's Mercedes blocking my driveway. Here, I narrated, is Brenda Blackwood, HOA president, blocking my private driveway, an act of harassment documented 22 times in the past month. The next image, the landscapers tearing up Sarah's memorial garden. Here is the memorial garden I planted for my late wife, being destroyed on Brenda's orders, a blatant act of emotional distress and disregard for human decency on land she claimed was communal, but which, as we have established, is legally mine. Next, a spreadsheet appeared, detailing inflated costs for the communal dock, cross-referenced with local construction bids. And here, ladies and gentlemen, are the actual quotes for the communal dock versus the amount the HOA paid, approved by Brenda, showing a 30% markup, which, interestingly, ended up paying for the expensive annual HOA holiday party held at Brenda's own residence. The room erupted in whispers. Some people gasped, others looked furious. Brenda's face was a mottled mask of crimson and white. And finally, Brenda, I continued, my voice cold, calm, and precise, I believe you have something to tell the community about why you so vehemently dismissed my initial claim of ownership, without, I might add, so much as a basic due diligence check with your own lawyers. I turned to the screen again. A final document appeared. It was an email, clearly from Brenda's personal account, to Mr. Sterling, her HOA lawyer, dated 2 days after my original letter asserting ownership. The subject line read, Henderson's ridiculous late claim. The body of the email was brief and damning. It read, Mr. Sterling, this Henderson character is making absurd claims about owning the lake. Do not waste a second of your time investigating this. It's obviously a tactic to avoid the fines. Just send him the standard dismissal and threaten further action. My sources tell me his grandfather was a senile old fool and would never have bothered with proper land registration. Just make him go away. I need this lake for my Save the Waterfowl charity gala next month, and I will not have any unpleasantness. A collective gasp swept through the room. The email, in black and white, laid bare her arrogance, her willful negligence, her contempt for the truth, and her personal, self-serving agenda. My sources, of course, had simply been a subpoena in the ongoing lawsuit. My grandfather, I said, my voice cutting through the shocked silence, was a meticulous and brilliant man, Brenda, and he ensured his legacy and this lake were protected. And your sources, Brenda, like much of what you've said, were utterly, demonstrably false. You dismissed a legitimate legal claim based on arrogance and an unwillingness to do even the most basic research. You chose to bully, to dismiss, to harass. And now, you face the consequences. Brenda stood frozen, her eyes wide, darting from the screen to the angry faces of the residents, then to me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The queen of the cul-de-sac was dethroned, not by a coup, but by an undeniable avalanche of facts. Her hubris, her fatal flaw, had consumed her. She had been so sure of her power, so convinced of her own authority, that she had refused to even consider the possibility that she might be wrong, or, worse, that someone else might be right. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with legal authority, due to Mr. Henderson's undisputed, legally documented ownership of Lake Willow Creek and the HOA's under Brenda Blackwood's direction, repeated acts of trespass, harassment, and alleged financial impropriety, we have filed an immediate injunction. Effective immediately, the lake is closed to all access by the HOA and its members. Furthermore, due to the clear breach of fiduciary duty and the personal misconduct demonstrated, Mr. Henderson's suit seeks not only damages, but also the immediate removal of Brenda Blackwood from her position as HOA president and the dissolution of the current HOA board. The room exploded. Shouts, gasps, the clamor of a community finally realizing the extent of their deception. People began converging on Brenda, not with violence, but with angry demands for answers, for explanations. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, her erstwhile acolytes, were already scurrying out a side door, trying to distance themselves from the implosion. Brenda, white as a sheet, didn't utter another word. She simply turned and stumbled from the stage, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her like an old, dry wall. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Then it was replaced by the low hum of a community finally awakening. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Brenda. The lawsuit proceeded, and with the undeniable evidence of my lake ownership and her blatant misconduct, she had no defense. She resigned from the HOA board in disgrace, preempting a formal vote to remove her. The community, empowered by the truth, banded together. They initiated a full audit of the HOA's finances, which revealed a disturbing pattern of mismanagement and a few outright fraudulent expenditures, all overseen by Brenda. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, quickly dropped her as a client. Faced with crippling legal fees, potential criminal charges, and the wrath of an entire neighborhood, Brenda Blackwood sold her McMansion at a significant loss and moved away, vanishing from Willow Creek Estates like a bad dream. The universal, "I want to speak to the manager" haircut had finally been told where to go. With Brenda gone, the community was in a state of flux. They had lost their lake access, but they had also gained their freedom. I held all the cards. I could have fenced off the lake, built a fortress, and lived in complete isolation. But that wasn't my way, and it certainly wasn't what my grandfather would have wanted. I called another community meeting, this time not to confront, but to build. I stood before them, a different man than the one who had raged at Brenda. My voice, calm and measured, carried an undeniable authority born of hard-won victory. "I understand your frustration, your anger, and your confusion," I began. "This lake has been a part of your lives, even if you didn't know who truly owned it. My grandfather believed in stewardship, in sharing resources responsibly, and so do I. I laid out a proposal. I would not sell the lake. It was part of my family legacy, part of my soul. But I would establish a new, legally binding entity, the Willow Creek Conservancy. It would be a non-profit organization run by a board of community volunteers dedicated to the preservation and responsible enjoyment of Lake Willow Creek. I would lease the lake to the Conservancy for a symbolic sum, $1 a year, under the condition that it would be managed transparently, ethically, and for the benefit of all residents, with clear rules established by the Conservancy Board, not by an autocratic HOA president. My only specific stipulations were that the lake remain pristine, free of gas-powered motors, and that my family's fishing dock be designated as a historic landmark, a testament to my grandfather's enduring legacy. The community response was overwhelmingly positive. The collective sigh of relief was almost palpable. They saw not a tyrant replacing another, but a partner, a protector. A new HOA board was elected, comprised of genuinely invested residents, including the young IT professional and the elderly couple who had been bullied. They abolished many of Brenda's draconian rules and focused on genuine community improvement, not petty control. Today, a year later, Lake Willow Creek thrives. The Willow Creek Conservancy is fully operational, run by a dedicated volunteer board. Residents enjoy the lake once more, fishing, kayaking, and paddleboarding. There's a new communal spirit, born from shared adversity and a new, just order. My memorial garden for Sarah has been restored, tended by my own hands and, occasionally, by appreciative neighbors. A small plaque by my grandfather's dock simply reads, "The Sanctuary, a Legacy of Peace," in memory of Arthur Henderson, 1910 to 1998 I often sit on that old dock now, my fishing line cast into the clear water, Baxter dozing at my feet. The lake reflects the sky, vast and peaceful. I found my sanctuary again, not by avoiding conflict, but by confronting it head-on. I learned that true peace isn't the absence of trouble, but the presence of justice. And sometimes the quietest people hold the most formidable power. Bullies, as I discovered, often defeat themselves with their own arrogance. True power, the kind that endures, comes from knowledge, from standing up for what's right, and from protecting your legacy. What would you have done if you discovered you owned the very thing a petty tyrant was trying to control? I imagine the comments will be filled with creative acts of revenge, and I'm eager to read them. My own revenge, I reflected, was simply to restore peace, not just to myself, but to an entire community. That, and knowing that Brenda Blackwood was somewhere else, probably still trying to tell someone's manager how to do their job, but without a single square inch of water to lord over. If you enjoyed this story of justice served, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell for more tales of triumph against tyranny. Next time, I'll tell you about the neighbor who thought my yard was a public dog park until I taught him a lesson in property rights and canine courtesy.